Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Allen November on Empowering Teachers, Engaging Students. My name is Holly Kurtz, and I direct the Education Week Research Center. Education Week is our webinar host, and I'll be your moderator. That means that I selected the questions you'll hear me ask during the next hour. Education Week is only hosting and moderating this webinar. Opinions are the sponsors and don't reflect endorsements by editorial projects in education or our publications. The sponsor, It's Learning, is responsible for selecting the content and the guests. Before I tell you any more about today's theme, let me highlight a few housekeeping issues. First, please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker volume settings if you are having audio trouble. If you're still having issues, please see the detailed audio troubleshooting file available in the resource list beneath the Q&A window. There are also some other icons located at the bottom of the webinar console that open some additional feature panels. You can read about today's speakers in the Speaker Bio panel and access the resource list to download a copy of today's slides. To submit a question for our speakers to answer during the Q&A session, and I hope you will, type your question into the Q&A box located above the resource list window. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. With that, let's get started on this afternoon's topic, Allen November on Empowering Teachers, Engaging Students. Allen will discuss how current shifts in education provide teachers with the opportunity to rethink their role and grow as professionals. Various aspects of an empowered teacher's role will be discussed, along with strategies for developing skills and competencies in those areas. In this webinar, Allen will cover technology's role in empowering teachers in ways teacher communities and PLNs can support professional development. Allen will also make the connection between empowered teachers and engaged students. Learn how students benefit from a focus on learner agency, peer learning, peer assessment, global perspectives, and more engaging real-world and personalized lessons and activities. Please use #EmpoweredTeacher to join the Twitter chat. Let me now introduce Allen. Allen November was named one of the USA's 15 most influential thinkers of the decade by Tech and Learning magazine. Allen's most recent book is Who Owns the Learning? He has worked with schools and universities in 40 countries to improve learning through innovative practice. He leads the Building Learning Communities Conference. With that, I will turn things over to Allen.
Thanks, Holly. And it's an honor to be here, and I'm thrilled that I don't have to go out in the blizzard to work, so it's all fun. You have to love technology when you can do things like this. And I just want to let people know that, especially if you know me, I'm prone to try to push the envelope on the conversation. So I just hope that the ideas I'm presenting are good enough to criticize, and I certainly look forward to your opinions and questions when we do the Q&A at the end of the session. So off we go. I'd like to start right away by just pointing out that I do think teachers are more important than ever, and I'm going to try to articulate why that is so. But to start, I'd really like to hear from you. And so our first poll question is, if you don't mind, please answer, during the past 10 years, teaching has become easier, harder, or stayed the same? So we'll wait about a minute and go ahead. And please click on one of those answers. And let's see, as soon as I move this slide, you are cut off, so vote now if you haven't yet. Okay, here we go. It's harder. Oh my gosh, look at that. Almost 90% say it's harder. That is fascinating. Next question is paired. During the past 10 years, learning has become easier, harder, stayed the same? Okay, once again, I'm going to press the go button, and we'll see what the vote is. And very different pattern. Majority think it's easier. Some say harder. Some say the same. I'd be curious to know, especially at the end, why folks think it's easier and harder. But it looks like easier wins out. That's fascinating. So teaching's harder, and learning by a slim majority is easier. That's a fascinating pattern, don't you think? So who currently works harder in classrooms? Students, teachers, or is it balanced? Who's currently working harder? And again, I'm going to push the go, and the answer is teachers are working harder, along with some balance. And the paired question is who should work harder? So what's your preferred reality? Students, teachers, or balanced working harder? And once again, I'll hit go because I think you guys are getting the hang of this. And it's a flip. We're down to students and balanced, working harder, with teachers going way down. It's a fascinating pattern. So if I got it, teaching's harder over the last 10 years. Kids need to work harder, and somehow we have to help teachers sort out why it's harder over 10 years. So these are my trends. I've made this stuff up. You decide what your trends are. And I know this is somewhat provocative, but over the term, my own sense is that the knowledge subject of a teacher is going to go down because the internet is just filled with content, models, and simulations. And so teachers' knowledge, while still essential, of all the things teachers do, I believe is going to go down. So that's talk less, to sum it all up. And the increase of a teacher's skill is the diagnostic skill of learning more and more about how students learn. So I think we're going to see this shift in the role and job description of teachers. And I also believe, I certainly hope, although there's not a lot of evidence that this is happening yet, that more classrooms are going to be connected to the world for authentic conversations and authentic work, and really deepening conversations beyond what you could do in one classroom. So those are my three trends, and I'll be curious to hear what you think the three trends are, any trend, especially if they're different from these. What that adds up to is the teacher is more of a learner. So, in fact, I'm fascinated that while students have to learn in classrooms, teachers generally teach what they already know. It's incredible to me that we don't have more teachers showing students actually how they learn with problems they've never seen before, so they can really demonstrate how a learner approaches things. So that whole conversation fascinates me about what should the balance be between teachers learning and teachers sharing what they already know. And of course, a lot of that learning isn't so much about subject material, but it's about learning how students learn. So the teacher is the chief learner. And global collaborator and publisher, we're going to get into that. And maybe one of the areas that is the absolute most important, but I see this huge deficit in how schools are addressing it, is teaching critical thinking on the internet. Somehow we've missed that as a nation, and I am deeply concerned about that. I've been talking about that since the 90s, and I didn't think I would still be doing it today, but I think it's worse than ever. So off we go. I also think kids have new roles. In fact, this whole concept of kids having roles, I think, is emerging. Some of this comes out of the book I wrote, Who Owns the Learning? And it has to do with giving kids jobs. The students become tutorial designers and documenting their learning and sharing it and researching curriculum. What's not on that list is I think students should also design assessment, especially self-assessment. And if we were to reflect on the job description of kids, I think that would ease some of the burden our teachers are feeling, that we really need to reconsider the relationship of teachers to students and see if we can offload some of what teachers now do to students. And it seems to especially line up with what the group said, that the preferred model is for teachers, rather students, to work harder. And I think they should work harder. And not only that, I think they want to work harder. Because in this case, as long as the work is creative and imaginative, I think students will respond to it really well. In fact, I'll try to give some examples of that. One of the first things I want to show you that help teachers learn more about students are tools that reveal student thinking or make thinking more visible. And PRISM happens to be a free tool from the University of Virginia where teachers can cut and paste any text that the class is reading. And this is kind of fun because it's all web-based, and certainly if you're using It's Learning, you can just plug in the link that generates for every PRISM activity you create. So you can use the It's Learning platform as your home base. And as students highlight, and this is how PRISM works, you're given 3 colors. Red, in this case, teachers can make the 3 colors anything they want, and red represented what's the most difficult. And as students highlight words as a class, font size changes. So in one look, a teacher can understand the thinking of an entire class. And so axiological and ontological pop, because that's in the short phrase that I've cut here, that's what's indicated by the majority of students who highlighted that word. What's fascinating to me about giving teachers these insights into what a whole class is thinking also has an amazing impact on student behavior, because a lot of kids, when you talk to them about why they don't raise their hand in class and why they don't participate, will sometimes say, and this is almost a direct quote, I don't know what the other kids are thinking when a teacher asks us to raise our hands, so it's just not safe for me to participate. But when I can see what the whole class is thinking, then it's much more safe and I can participate. And I have witnessed this in classrooms using PRISM, where kids are much more engaged and much more willing to take risk. And teachers are learning more about what students are doing. So I'm fascinated by tools like PRISM that give insight and at the same time make classrooms safer. I'm also fascinated by this counterintuitive research at Harvard called the curse of knowledge. Now, if anything requires a second thought, it's this. In fact, I just couldn't buy this myself when I first heard it. Basically, Harvard professors know too much to understand a first-time learner. And I've heard kids say that their teachers just know too much, that they're so good at their subject that sometimes they miss that their students are just not getting it while class is happening. And of course, if students are afraid to ask questions, there's no indication that they're not getting it. And I'm also fascinated by Eric Mazur, one of my heroes in all this, the Dean of Applied Physics at Harvard. I've seen his classroom, and he has created this amazing environment where students help each other continuously. And he's so fascinated by this because first-time learners don't explain things the way Harvard professors do. So he's really learning a lot about the issues of a first-time learner and how to really reach them, because he's created this peer-to-peer model of learning in his classroom. So I think it goes all the way through, from early elementary through university, and now I'm taking this cursive knowledge seriously. And this is an example of a tutorial I've been showing for a long time. It's actually a screenshot from a video of a 12-year-old explaining how to factor the number 32. And you can see on the left, on the blue side of things, that she starts with a prime number as one of the first two factors, 2 times 16. And she checked this with friends because she only had the left side done in her original tutorial. And all of her friends who saw her do this thought you have to start with a prime factor. So that's why she does it twice in 2 different colors. So she shows that you don't have to start with prime, 8 by 4, instead of 2 by 16. So I'm fascinated when students create tutorials that they really test things with their friends to see if the lesson's working. And this is a job I think we should do in every classroom. If I were going to start a school from scratch, I would absolutely want a faculty to be empowering children with the tool set to create tutorials to help other kids learn. And again, that would offload a tremendous amount of time and effort on the part of the teacher answering basic questions like factoring, and you can get on to more interesting things like when to apply factoring. So again, job description change of the student, offloading for the teacher, and frankly, I think it would unleash an army of creativity. I know that lots of teachers are working hard creating videos, but I'm convinced students should be creating the majority of those videos. This is simply an international list of the traffic flow to that classroom who are using those tutorials. And then this happened to be in July. You can see it's July 8th when I captured this. So summertime, and all those countries have logged in a 5-hour period from all over the world. And what really fascinates me about connecting classrooms to the world is how motivating it can be. So I was talking to the girl who created that tutorial, and I showed her that list. I was actually in the classroom. And I said, you know, you're popular all over the world. And she didn't believe me at first. And finally, she believed me. And she leaves. She gets up and she starts walking away, this meeting we're having. And I said, where are you going? And she said, I have to create more. I just found out the world needs me. And I just think that's what we ought to do. We ought to build schools where kids feel the world needs me. It's a different motivation than a grade. It's about purpose. I'm a big fan of Dan Pink and his book Drive, where he talks about purpose being one of the most important motivators of student work. And I think we ought to embed purpose in schools. And it's just not clear to me that traditional assessment provides purpose, but global publishing and students who create work and think the world needs them, that's powerful. Again, on global connections, this happens to be a Twitter feed out of a classroom in Vietnam. The boy in Vietnam is showing a video camera he made out of junk. That feed is being watched by first graders in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, in Kathy Cassidy's classroom. And they see this boy in Vietnam doing what we could call a STEM project, and they're excited because they see a kid can do it, And so this global connection not only is limited to kids, publishing their work, but also checking in on kids all over the world. What are they doing? And I think that can be incredibly motivating, this peer-to-peer inspiring opportunity. And again, I just think every classroom should be globally connected. Not only that, but in terms of teacher as learner, one of those top 3 themes, I think a lot of teachers who do see what other classrooms are doing on a regular basis all over the world are potentially learning more and more about what kids can achieve. They see the inspiring impact on their kids. They might not have thought of building a camera out of junk, or even that first graders could have done it. But once those kids see other kids, it's hard to stop them. So I just love this idea that kids are globally connected, researching topics, looking for projects, and then begging their teachers to learn more. Or, an expression from the beginning, they're working harder. Now, I want to go on now to another topic, clean problems versus messy problems. So clean problems are, solve for X. You give students the right amount of information before they take the next test or do homework. We're well organized. We have great lesson plans. And as long as you pay attention in class and you study, you should be able to nail it, right? Messy problems aren't quite the same. Messy problems are you don't give kids the right information at the right time. You purposely insert misleading information. You leave out information. Messy problems are a whole nother way of looking at inspiring kids. And I know it sounds messy, but I think we ought to give more messy problems to kids. I don't think we should, forgive me, it sounds somewhat cynical, spoon feed them answers to make sure they understand everything they're supposed to. I think we should make kids dig and work harder, especially with the internet. So this is an example of a messy problem. Teacher shoots out this photograph of a cup in the original tweet. It's just a cup. And the kid thinks about this cup because this is really important. Instead of saying solve for volume of the cup, and that means every student in the class would do the same homework problem, solve the volume, you instead cross out solve and replace it with involve. So involve volume means that students have to become problem designers. So this student invents an ice cube, puts in a vertical and a radius, and basically comes up with this really complicated problem. If you add 3 of those ice cubes, will the cup overflow if there's only an inch left at the top? And that problem is so complicated because it involves some physics, the displacement of ice. You got to take 2 volumes and subtract it, that no geometry teacher in their right mind would probably give that problem because you have to cover the curriculum. But if you're doing it just for fun, just for extra credit, then it's okay. And what fascinated me is that the teacher in this case, a wonderful teacher who was Teacher of the Year after starting Messy Problems, a woman named Jessica Cavanis outside Dallas. There were cases when kids come up with problems and she has to think about how to solve them because she's never seen a displacement of ice problem. And Jessica does an amazingly good job of showing kids how she learns. And I think kids love the idea that they can come up with such a creative problem that their teacher doesn't know how to solve it in their own subject. So clearly, this kind of relationship of kids designing problems from a prompt that initiates, the sequence from the teacher isn't for every teacher, because if you don't have the thinking of a Jessica Cavanis who loves the challenge that kids give her, and you have another kind of teacher who hates the idea that she has to demonstrate she doesn't know something and that's not so good. So the only people who should be doing this are teachers who are very confident about their sense of self in front of kids, that they can say, I don't know how to solve that problem, but I'm going to show you how I learn. I just think that's incredibly powerful. Now I want to move on to search. If you don't know, Stanford College of Education last November released a research study of 7,800 students in the country, from middle school through university, including Stanford, and they had given various channels of information, social media like Facebook and things on the web, and the researchers were shocked at how poorly students did in this country, distinguishing whether something was true or false. In fact, if you ask any kid if they can use Google, probably every kid will say, I know how to use Google. But then when you actually start watching them and you give them some simple, relatively simple problems, things can break down pretty quickly. Just to give you some results, only 30% of students at Stanford could distinguish between things that were true or false in this research study. Now, if we were teaching reading and it was in print and Stanford students could only figure out, reading a book or an article, that something was true or false, we would think that was a disaster. And we would go back over how do we teach reading. But because we don't have a test in critical thinking on the internet, because we don't actually test it and we don't really add this up, because I think we're still defining literacy as can you read print, I'm incredibly concerned that while we're looking backwards at a definition of literacy, our students have no concept of critical thinking on the internet. And if you're a fan of Marshall McLuhan, you might recall that in the 60s, he predicts the internet and basically says the medium is the message, and if you learn in one medium how to read, paper, for example, it does not mean that you are literate on the internet. In fact, chances are you're not. And the scariest part of this transition from one media to another in definition of literacy is if you don't know, and you think you know, it's even worse. In fact, I wrote to the researchers at Stanford. They're now engaged in a second follow-up study. This time, they're testing teachers and professors, and they wouldn't reveal the data, but they did indicate to me that it's not pretty. So it's quite possible that our educators don't know they don't know, our students don't know, and we're in serious problem if this is true. This is an example of one day I'm working with kids, and I asked them to use Google and just type in American history. And at the time, there was this movie on American history, and it showed images like this of the characters in the movie in the top screen. And as you can guess, kids don't usually go past the top screen. And I was watching them do this, and I knew this was going to come up. I actually set the kids up, and I asked them, why do you think you get a skinhead with a SWAT sticker if you type in American history? And the response of one kid is, Google's broken. It made a mistake. It shouldn't have done it. The kid didn't understand the algorithm. And so I just want to show you how you could have avoided this. Oh, got to do this one first. If you haven't done this, please do this. Type in Google, are cats better than dogs? And take a look at your results. I'm going to guess, wherever you are in the world, that if you type in, are cats better than dogs, Google's going to tell you cats are unequivocally better than dogs. All the results in the top screen, I'm going to predict cats better than dogs. If you type in, are dogs better than cats, then Google is going to tell you unequivocally that dogs are better than cats. Well, both can't be unequivocal at the same time. And you can imagine what's going on here is Google is not really designed to give you the objective best information in the world. It's really designed to figure out what you want. And it does that with algorithm and others. And so it sees that your bias, if you type in are cats better, that cats are better. And that's what it gives you. So if you follow this through, what this basically means is that for some of our students, depending on how they design searches, they're getting biased information every time they use Google because they've never gone through this activity and don't have a sense of the design of the algorithm. So this frightens me. I mean, there's no way we would design libraries where you get the books you want based on your own biased view of the world. That'd be insane, but that is happening every day with Google. So we really have to create critical thinkers on the internet. And this is a picture of a mouse with an ear off its back. It's another activity I use. If you look at the BBC article that describes the ear and the mouse, the opening sentence in the BBC article says that the ear grew out of the back of the mouse. If you look at the Wikipedia article on the same mouse, it explains that that ear was cow-shaped cartilage into the form of an ear and then implanted under the skin of the mouse. It did not grow out of the back of the mouse. So this is an example of two different versions of the truth. And I'm sad to report, when I show this to kids and I show them the BBC article and I ask them for the action verb and explain how the ear got on the back of the mouse, just about every kid, when looking at Wikipedia compared to the BBC, will tell you that the BBC is correct. The BBC is not correct. Wikipedia is correct. And then I'll ask kids, why did you say that Wikipedia was wrong and the BBC was right? And they'll often say, our teachers told us not to trust Wikipedia ever, which is absolutely the wrong thing to tell kids. If you're going to tell them not to trust Wikipedia, then you should also tell them not to trust the BBC. And so I'm scared that a lot of kids are using the web as their dominant media every day, and they don't understand the algorithm, and they don't understand how to validate whether something's true or false. So this example I've been using for a while. A student told me they had an assignment on the Iranian hostage crisis, and typically a student's strategy for search is to take their teacher's assignment word for word and use that as their Google search terms. But most assignments were not designed to be a Google search term. And so the real reference to the Iranian hostage crisis in Iran is not the Iranian hostage crisis. It's conquest of the American spy den. And so if you type in Iranian hostage crisis, wherever you are, especially in North America, chances are you will not get any sources from Iran. And that's really important that you do, because getting perspective on a problem is probably one of the most important skills in using the internet. And it frightens me, again, that students don't know how to change the country perspective of a search. So here we have a photograph of a wonderful classroom. It happens to be in Florida. And all these kids have different jobs. You can see they're all engaged. You can see the teacher sitting at her desk. She's not being lazy. She's watching these kids and responding. But kids are basically self-directed, all have a clearly defined task. They happen to be engaged in some global conversation. You have kids documenting their learning. You have kids using back channels to promote what they're learning. You have kids who are researching the web. They all have different jobs, and they're well defined. And this image to me, you can just pass a classroom and see that the kids are working harder than the teacher. And so I just want to come back to that. I do agree that teaching has become more difficult over the last 10 years. And I'm concerned we haven't even begun, that it's going to become much more difficult, especially, the craziness of the web and more and more initiatives on teachers. I'm really worried. And I think it's past time that we need to re-examine the job description of kids and the job description of teachers and rewrite both of those to match the power of the internet. And if we don't, I'm concerned that if the trend line continues, and there seems to be some agreement with the audience, that we're just going to have burnout. And that would be unfortunate, that we lose lots of good teachers as a result of that. So that may be one of the most important things to do. I think we should actually stop doing technology for a little while and take a deep breath and figure out job descriptions. So just to sum up, I do think teachers are more important than ever. Again, not for their subject knowledge, but for their ability to learn. And that falls into two categories: to learn how they can solve problems in their subject they've never seen before, to demonstrate what a good learner does, and also to learn more about their students so that they can personalize instruction. So I think it's an amazingly exciting time. I don't think we can move forward with the current job descriptions we've inherited, and that concerns me. And adding tools alone will certainly not be sufficient. So I hope it was good enough to criticize. I certainly look forward to questions and opinions. All I know is I think it's an incredibly exciting time if we ask the right questions. So Holly, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you for your presentation. We're going to now turn to the Q&A, giving our guests a chance to answer some questions. From our audience. The first question comes from Michael, and Michael wants to know, why are schools struggling with developing an authentic learning environment?
Yeah. I don't have a good research answer for that. I have an opinion. My opinion is that assessment drives what we do in our schools. And if that's true, authentic learning is typically not part of assessment. And so we're stuck with what we might call spoon feeding, which takes out any awe and wonder in an effort to deliver assessment. I want to be wrong on that, but I think there may be more truth to what I just said than it being a falsehood.
Okay. Here's a question from Caroline, who wants to know, what are the best practices for leading learners through the development of good questions?
Whoa, that's a great question. I'm a fan of the Right Question Institute. And Dan Rothstein heads that up. And if you Google the Right Question Institute, you'll come to Dan's website, where he has lots of resources on helping teachers teach students how to generate more and more interesting questions. And in my point of view, I really love this question, because I think teaching students to ask the most interesting questions may absolutely be one of the most important teacher skills. which is an amazing shift from giving them answers. And so I'll just point you to that, because that's a whole nother webinar. But to tease you a little bit, in Dan's view, there's roughly two kinds of questions, open and closed. So a closed question is, who wrote the book? Because once you answer that, there's no more discussion. An open question is, what's the impact of the book on society? And that can go on forever. So Dan has processes to help teachers teach kids to take closed questions and turn them into open questions to get more interesting questions. So, Right Question Institute, Dan Rothstein.
Okay. Here is a question from Jeannie, who wants to know, how do we teach them to distinguish between what's true and false on the internet? Simply directing them to sites that you know to be sound and true? Other suggestions?
No, I think we should be directing them to sites we know are false. In the old days, we only directed kids to what's true. We selected books, we had good magazines in the library, encyclopedia and atlas and all that. We never really showed them bad books and falsehoods. And now I think, because they're going to run into that on their own, we really need to design assignments that purposely mislead kids and purposely show them bogus and false content on the internet, and then teach them, how do you validate? What strategies do you use? So I don't want to clean things up. I want to deal with the way it is and give kids some very powerful lessons on coming face to face with being manipulated at all ages too.
Okay. Here's a question from Lavinia, who says, we've had assessment forever. Why is it that they don't work anymore? We grew up with assessment, and that did not kill our desire to learn. Why are assessments killing today's kids' motivation?
Well, when I was a kid, I'm pretty certain, and when I started teaching Lexington High School in the 70s, I was not handed a test to give kids. I created my own. And I would like to think that they were difficult and creative, and teachers were empowered. And so it's not that testing itself is bad. It's the quality of the tests, in my opinion. The multiple choice driven stuff drives me crazy. I know you can have creative examples of that, but typically not. I also worry that our assessment models have not kept up with the reality of being literate. And I've already tried to nail that one, with web literacy. I've never seen a test in this country on critical thinking on the internet. And I think if we did have one and it was required, then every teacher would be doing it almost overnight. So if I'm right, there's an example of where, because of a lack of a test, we are not teaching maybe one of the most important skills we should be providing our students.
Okay. Well, here's a question from Helene. What is the significance of the flipped learning movement and the empowerment of teachers and the engaging of students?
Yeah. I have my opinions on that. So, I could be wrong. I'll say that up front. I'm not the fan I used to be. Watching videos, if you define flip learning, and there's different definitions. So if you define flip learning as, we're going to move content to videos, and you're going to have these videos available for kids to review material, and then they're going to do homework in class, you're changing class to homework and homework to class. That's the flip, if I understand this question correctly. That by itself, I don't think is a very exciting prospect. I happen to think that we have to change the content of the videos. So, example, an earlier comment about authentic learning and about classrooms that are globally connected, and about kids creating video tutorials rather than their teacher. Because watching videos is actually a very passive way of learning. And I worry a lot about that. Any time a new process takes off, like flipped learning, I worry that we haven't thought it completely through. And I'm convinced we have not thought this completely through.
Okay. Here's a question from Christopher who wants to know, how can we as teachers facilitate students monitoring and reflecting on their academic progress?
Yeah, I think there's lots of processes getting kids to reflect. In fact, if you just go back to PRISM, if we revisit that one tool I showed, PRISM happens to come with 3 highlight colors. And those 3 highlight colors can be given any value. You know, noun, verbs, adjectives, difficult to understand, debatable, and so forth, whatever you want. So what we could do is have students, for example, who are learning to write, put their writing into PRISM, and then, you know, along with the teacher, they can highlight their own writing before they hand it in, reflecting on, you know, where's my best use of descriptive language? That could be blue. Red could be, you know, where do I need the most help? And green could just be anything the teacher wants to set up. So that students are reflecting on their writing before they hand it in. And because it's a highlight and not another piece of writing, I've seen kids do this. There are other tools like that we can use to have kids reflect on their work. I can tell you that I'm a huge fan of a Harvard professor named David Mallon, who teaches Introduction to Computer Science. David is perhaps the most popular teacher at Harvard. About 800 students take his class every semester it's offered. He co-teaches it at Yale, one of the most popular classes at Yale. The workload is enormous, much more than the average class at Harvard or Yale, and yet it's the most popular. One of the aspects of that class is that students have to assess all their own work. In fact, they have to assess it on 3 levels. They have to assess their work effort, then they have to assess the actual quality of the work, then they have to determine what would be the official grade if, you know, the teacher were grading it compared to a grade they would give, and if the grades are different, they have to reconcile the differences. And I'm fascinated that he does that he requires this extra effort. Again, this is students working harder. It shows more insight to the teacher as students assess their work effort and what they believe is the quality of their work. It requires students to think more deeply about responsibility of the quality of their work. And I'll just tell you, my son Dan had David Mallon, and it changed his life. He went from thinking teachers and professors were in charge of the quality of his work to his own self, and it's done him incredibly well. And he even suggested in conversation that he could have been doing that in elementary school, but no teacher through his entire grade school required him to self-assess.
Okay. I'm going to turn now to a question from Lisa, who says, we are designing our units of inquiry and we are trying to figure out what is worth inquiring into. Student agency, global perspective are key goals of ours. What makes something worthy of inquiry?
Well, I really can't answer that exactly. Inquire, the value would be in the eyes of the learner, really. So if you have passion about designing, birdhouses, and you really go at it well, and you look at the design of birdhouses all over the world, and you get in touch with zoos all over the world, and you remix video of design of, the impact of birdhouses in marshland where birds are coming back as a result of these birdhouses. I just go on and on about birdhouses. You might not think that birdhouses, compared to curing cancer, is something of value. But if it's the passion of the learner, I would encourage it. So I would just slightly change the question. Should we learn about the passion of learners and allow them to pursue that passion, but do it extremely well?
Okay. Here's a question from Rob, who wants to know, how does the use of technology enhance the teacher-student relationship?
Well, it can go either way. I've learned. I happen to think, similar to It's Learning, that you can build community, that you can have students asking questions online that they might not ask face-to-face, which makes asking questions safer. And you can connect to the world, and you can give tools that, as I said already, self-assessment. We have opportunity for teachers to record their voice in student work, and it turns out that lots of students prefer to listen to their teacher's voice than read written comments, and that can be huge. Just asking teachers who are teaching writing to give oral comments. So this, from simple to complicated. We also, are entering a time of, advanced simulation design, where you can go inside of molecules and see things you just can't see with the human eye, big and small. That's very revealing. I can go on and on about the benefits of technology. What worries me is that if you talk to any school counselor, and I mean everyone I've ever talked to in the last couple of years, and you ask school counselors, is stress up or down of kids? Every school counselor I've talked to, maybe there's some on this webinar, say stress is up. There's no question our kids are feeling more stress. And then I'll say, well, why? What's going on that kids are feeling more stress? And they talk about the pressure on kids in social media, what girls have to reveal in Facebook, and the pressure of constantly checking, what's your online profile, and the bullying that's skyrocketing, and the distraction and the agitation. So I'm concerned that it's quite possible that the overall impact of technology, unintended yet real, is quite negative. So go ask a school counselor if that's true.
Okay. Here's a question from Catherine, who wants to know, is there a course out there you can recommend for teaching critical thinking on the internet?
You should come to my summer conference. I have a lot of material on my website at novemberlearning.com on a web literacy section, articles and activities. I actually wrote a book years ago called Web Literacy, but it's out of date right now. So I've been doing this a long time. The way I would do it today is I would type in web literacy in quotes in Google and the word tutorial, and then the Google Operator site, site:/edu. So site:/edu, web literacy tutorial, and you'll see Berkeley's got a great one, UPenn has a great one. There are some amazing tutorials in web literacy at universities. So as long as you do the site:/edu, you limit your results to that, and you'll see some incredible resources.
Okay. Now I'm going to turn to a question from Christopher, who says, what factors do I need to consider in scaffolding my students' learning from traditional teacher-directed instruction to more student-centered approaches?
Yeah, again, I think there's a million different answers to that question. If I were going to do one thing first, it would be what I've mentioned. I'd have students designing tutorials. So that way teachers wouldn't even have to change what they're doing. It would only be that you would give students an option. Instead of doing homework for that night, they could opt out to design a tutorial. And then over time, with teacher approval, you'd be building a library of student-designed tutorials that would cover the curriculum that would help other kids learn, thereby shifting, responsibility to the student design team, the tutorial design team. Another first step would be a process that Eric Mazur has introduced at Harvard in taking tests. So what he does is he gives a test just like you would normally expect. Every student is on their own, no cheating, no collaboration. The tests are handed in. Then you take the exact same test again immediately, but this time in a team. The team selection is really an important skill of the teacher. But kids in a team take the same test. They debate every item. They don't know the answers. And they have to defend their answers and question their classmates back and forth all year. And by doing that, by building in this peer review of peer, self-assessment, that can be incredibly powerful as a way to engage students in reflecting on their own work and conversation. And again, it also takes care of the curse of knowledge, because kids will explain things about what's on a test in a way a teacher never would when they go over the test. In fact, Eric will tell you that. He hears that all the time. So those are the two things that I would do first, because it doesn't require fancy technology. It's just common sense, and off you go.
All right, this is going to be our last question. The question is from Badrul, who wants to know, how can teachers strike a balance between the compulsion of completing the stipulated syllabus and aspiration to have more freedom in designing the activities?
All right, so we have, you would hope that, like my friend Jessica teaching geometry, she has a required syllabus for the state exam. She has to get through that. But she gives these messy problems. And not only that, but when she started giving messy problems, students started using their cell phones to take photographs of messy problems. And it's all extra credit. It's all beyond the curriculum. And so she kind of runs this parallel curriculum. One is the required syllabus, and the other is this incredible, fun, inspiring, optional stuff. And believe it or not, the majority of her students are engaged in this optional stuff. I can't explain it. Maybe it's because it's exciting and they own it and they design it, and they're thinking about real problems all the time. So that's That's just one teacher's way of managing that.
All right, Alan, thank you very much for that response. We have now reached the end of our webinar, Alan November, on empowering teachers engaging students. Thanks so much to our sponsor, It's Learning, and of course to Alan. Before we go, I would like to remind everyone that an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we hope to see you all again at a future Education Week webinar.